Marcus stepped into the huge lecture hall, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the smell of new books and fresh coffee in the air. The room was buzzing with chatter, strangers meeting for the first time, exchanging names, laughing nervously. He found a seat near the middle, not too far in front, not hidden in the back. He liked it that way. It was his first day at one of the most prestigious universities in the country, a place where the smartest minds gathered, and where the professors were known as legends in their fields. But Marcus knew another side of that reputation. They were also known for being proud, arrogant, and harsh toward students they thought didn't belong. The professors walked in together. Their expensive suits pressed perfectly, their faces calm but sharp. They looked like men who had seen it all and had no patience for mistakes. The tallest one, Professor Harrow, placed his briefcase on the desk and scanned the room slowly, as if he was already judging each student's worth. His eyes stopped on Marcus for a second, a long, heavy second before moving on. Marcus didn't flinch, but inside, he felt the weight of that look. He had heard stories from older students about how these professors liked to test newcomers, sometimes embarrassing them in front of everyone. They called it preparing them for the real world. Marcus knew it was really about power. Still, he wasn't here to pick a fight. He just wanted to learn, keep his head down, and do his work. As students took turns introducing themselves, Marcus noticed something. The professors smiled politely at some students, especially those with famous last names or who mentioned prep schools and internships. But when a student stumbled over words or mentioned coming from a public school, the professor's smiles faded into blank stares. When it was Marcus's turn, he stood and said, "My name is Marcus. I'm from Detroit. I've always loved mathematics." His voice was steady, but he noticed the flicker in Professor Harrow's eyes, almost like a smirk. Another professor leaned toward him and whispered something, making Harrow chuckle quietly. Marcus didn't know exactly what they said, but he could guess. He sat back down, his mind calm on the outside, but alert on the inside. Something told him they'd remember him not in a friendly way, but as someone they might try to put in his place. He had seen that look before, back in high school, when certain teachers assumed his abilities before hearing him speak or seeing his work. The introductions ended, and the professors began their opening talk. They spoke about discipline, the long hours, the unforgiving standards of their department. Every sentence felt like a challenge. Marcus listened carefully, not because he was intimidated, but because he knew that in this place, every word mattered. Then Professor Harrow started walking between the rows, glancing at students' notebooks, asking random questions to catch them off guard. A few students laughed nervously when they didn't know the answers. Marcus kept his eyes forward, hands still, ready for anything. Harrow's shoes clicked against the floor as he walked past Marcus, slowing just enough to glance down. For a moment, it felt like a silent message. "I'm watching you." Marcus didn't move. Inside, he reminded himself of something his grandmother always told him. "Let your work speak. Words are easy. Proof is harder." As the lecture continued, the air in the room felt different. Marcus could sense that this wasn't just going to be a normal semester. Something was building here, like a storm slowly moving in. And though he didn't know when, he could feel it. The professors would test him. They'd try to push him. Down in front of everyone, what they didn't know was that Marcus had been preparing for moments like this his whole life. He wasn't afraid of hard problems. He wasn't afraid of pressure. And he definitely wasn't afraid of showing what he could do when the time was right. For now, he just sat quietly, letting the professors think whatever they wanted, because Marcus knew something they didn't. When the storm came, he'd be ready. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the lecture hall as the students settled into their seats for the second day of class. Marcus walked in quietly, his face calm, but his mind sharp and alert. He had noticed something on the first day, a certain way the professors looked at him, especially Professor Harrow. It wasn't the kind of look that came from curiosity. It was the kind of look a chess player gives an opponent before making the first move. The air was different today. The professors seemed more energized, their voices carrying a faint excitement. Marcus could feel it in the way they glanced at him, as if they were waiting for the right moment. He didn't know exactly what they were planning, but he knew it involved him. Professor Harrow stood at the front, tapping the chalk against the blackboard. Today, he announced, "We're going to see just how sharp our new students really are." His tone was smooth, almost friendly, but Marcus could hear the challenge hidden underneath. Some of the students leaned forward in curiosity. Others smirked, already guessing that someone was about to be tested. The first few questions went to random students, quick math problems. Basic definitions, nothing too hard. Harrow smiled at the ones who answered correctly, but there was no warmth in his smile. It was the smile of a man setting a trap. Then, without warning, his eyes locked on Marcus. "Mr. Marcus," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "you said yesterday you love mathematics, didn't you?" A few heads turned toward Marcus. He nodded. "Yes, sir." "Excellent," Harrow replied, his lips curling slightly. "Let's put that love to the test." He turned to the blackboard and began writing an equation. Not just any equation, but one that stretched across the board in twisting lines of numbers and symbols. The sound of the chalk scraping against the board filled the room. When he stepped back, even some of the top students frowned, trying to make sense of it. Marcus studied it from his seat. He recognized the complexity immediately. It wasn't the kind of problem you gave to a student on the second day of class. This was something graduate-level students struggled with. The message was clear. Harrow wasn't testing his knowledge. He was setting him up to fail. Harrow turned around, holding out the chalk. "Care to solve it for us?" The room went quiet. A few students shifted in their seats, some whispering under their breath. Marcus stood slowly, not rushing, and walked toward the board. He didn't pick up the chalk right away. Instead, he stood in front of the problem, reading it carefully, as if listening to what it was trying to say. Behind him, Harrow crossed his arms, confident in the outcome. Another professor leaned forward in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. They were expecting Marcus to hesitate, to guess, to crumble under the pressure. But Marcus wasn't nervous. He had faced harder problems before, not just in math, but in life. Numbers couldn't intimidate him the way people tried to. He turned his head slightly and asked, "Would you like me to explain the steps as I go?" The question caught Harrow off guard. "If you think you can," he replied, his voice still calm, but his eyes narrowing just a little. Marcus nodded and picked up the chalk. His hand moved steadily, writing the first few lines with complete confidence. As he spoke, his voice was even clear and calm, no stumbles, no pauses. The room, which had been filled with the faint sound of shuffling papers and tapping pens, went completely still. With every step Marcus took, the impossible-looking equation began to shrink, its complexity unraveling. Students leaned forward, watching closely. Even those who didn't fully understand the math could see that his logic was flawless. Harrow's smirk faded slightly. This wasn't the reaction he had planned. Marcus wasn't just surviving the test, he was controlling it. By the time Marcus reached the last step, the room felt different. The tension had shifted. It was no longer the professors holding the power. It was Marcus, standing at the board, about to close the problem with one final stroke of chalk. Marcus stood there, the chalk resting lightly between his fingers. The board was almost full now, but unlike when Professor Harrow had written on it, the lines of numbers and symbols no longer looked like chaos. They flowed in a clear order, each step building perfectly on the last. The class had fallen completely silent. Even the students who had been whispering earlier were now watching with wide eyes. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath. Marcus paused for just a second, reading over everything he had written. He wasn't pausing because he was unsure. He was pausing because he wanted the moment to settle in. He wanted the professors to feel it. Then, with one smooth motion, he wrote the final line, circling the answer neatly. It wasn't just correct. It was elegant. Every step made sense. No wasted movement, no hesitation. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights. Then a voice from the back broke the silence. Wait, is that right? It was one of the top students, a senior who had taken extra math courses and prided himself on his skills. He was leaning forward now, eyebrows raised. Another student muttered, "Yeah, that's right. I've seen this problem before. That's the solution." The murmurs spread quickly through the room. Heads turned toward Marcus, and then toward Professor Harrow. Harrow, who had been leaning against the desk with his arms crossed, was now sitting up straight. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were fixed on the board. He looked like a man who had just been handed a result he couldn't argue with, even if he wanted to. Marcus set the chalk down gently and turned back toward the class. "Done," he said simply, as if he'd just finished something ordinary. His calm voice made the moment. Even more powerful, Harrow cleared his throat. "Well," he began, his tone a little sharper than before. "That's impressive. But let's see if you can explain why each step works." Marcus almost smiled. He had been expecting this. Some people, when faced with proof, try to find another way to trip you up. He nodded and walked through the entire process again, explaining each step in plain, simple terms. He didn't just give the answer, he taught the room how to reach it. By the time he was done, the smirks on the other professors' faces were gone. The class was looking at Marcus differently now, not as just another student, but as someone who had done something remarkable. Harrow picked up the chalk, stared at the board for a moment, and then set it back down without saying much. He forced a small smile. "Very well, Mr. Marcus, you may take your seat." Marcus walked back to his chair, his expression unchanged. Inside, he felt a quiet satisfaction, not because he had beaten them, but because he had proven himself without raising his voice, without showing anger, without anything except skill and calmness. A few students nodded at him as he sat down, subtle signs of respect. One student whispered, "That was insane." And another mouthed the word genius under their breath. Harrow returned to his lecture, but something in his tone had shifted. There was less edge, less condescension. It didn't look Marcus's way again for the rest of the class. But Marcus knew this wasn't over. He could feel it. People like Harrow didn't like losing, and they didn't forget it. If anything, this had only made Marcus more of a target. Still, he didn't mind. He had faced worse before. And if they tried again, he'd be ready. The days that followed felt different. Marcus could feel eyes on him whenever he walked into the lecture hall. Some students watched with curiosity, others with quiet admiration. A few still didn't know what to make of him. But the professors, especially Harrow, seemed more focused than ever. It wasn't friendly focus. It was the kind of sharp, measuring look a hunter gives when deciding how to take down a prey that had escaped once before. Marcus could almost sense it. They were planning something. On Friday morning, the air in the room felt heavy, as if everyone knew something was going to happen. Harrow stood at the front, the usual smoothness in his voice replaced with something colder. "Today," he began, pacing slowly, "we will have an exercise. One that separates those who think they know from those who truly understand." The class shifted in their seats. Harrow smiled faintly, not the kind of smile that warmed a room, but one that promised trouble. "Let's make this interesting," Harrow continued. "Instead of volunteers, I will choose who comes forward." His eyes swept across the room. Some students looked down at their desks, avoiding his gaze. Others looked at him nervously, silently hoping they wouldn't be chosen. Then his eyes locked on Marcus. "Mr. Marcus," Harrow said, his tone dripping with deliberate emphasis, "would you join us at the board?" A few students exchanged glances. One of them whispered, "Here we go again." Marcus stood, calm as always, and walked toward the front. The other professors leaned forward in their chairs. There was a strange energy in the room, as though everyone was leaning in to watch a fight. Harrow picked up the chalk and began writing. A problem, not just one, but a layered equation with multiple branches, combining advanced calculus, abstract algebra, and probability theory. It wasn't something you could solve with quick tricks. This was meant to eat up time, cause mistakes, and make the solver stumble under pressure. But Harrow didn't stop there. "Oh," he added casually, "while you're working on this, I'll also ask you questions on theory. You'll need to explain why each step works, loud enough for the whole class to hear." Gasps rippled through the room. This wasn't just a test, it was a public spectacle, a trial meant to overwhelm and humiliate. Marcus took the chalk, studying the problem. For a long moment, his face stayed neutral, but inside, his mind was already moving fast. Breaking the problem into pieces, Harrow stepped to the side, folding his arms and watching. "Whenever you're ready." Marcus began writing, his movements steady and deliberate. With each stroke of the chalk, he explained what he was doing, his voice calm and clear. At first, the students followed along quietly. But as the problem grew more complex, many of them got lost. Still, Marcus never paused. Harrow interrupted him halfway through. "What's the theoretical principle behind that step?" And no vague answers. Marcus looked at him briefly. "It's based on the convergence property of infinite series," he replied, giving the exact name and its proof outline. He didn't just answer, he expanded on it, making it clear that he understood far beyond the surface. The class shifted again. Some students were now leaning forward in awe. Harrow tried again, tossing in unrelated theory questions while Marcus worked. It was meant to break his focus. But Marcus answered each one as smoothly as if he were reading from a book he'd memorized long ago. The chalk squeaked as Marcus closed in on the final steps. Sweat had formed on the brows of some students, not from the heat, but from the tension of watching. The trap the professors had set was failing right in front of them. Marcus paused just before the last line. He glanced at the problem, then at Harrow. For the briefest moment, their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, Harrow seemed to realize what was about to happen. Marcus wrote the final answer, underlined it, and stepped back silence. It wasn't the awkward silence of confusion. It was the heavy silence of a room that had just witnessed something they didn't expect. Marcus placed the chalk neatly on the ledge. "Done," he said. Harrow's jaw tightened. The other professors exchanged looks, but none spoke. For the second time, the plan to embarrass him had ended with the opposite result. Marcus walked back to his seat, the quiet whispers of admiration following him like a shadow. But deep down, he knew this battle wasn't over. It was just getting started. Asterisk. The moment Marcus returned to his seat, the lecture hall felt different. It wasn't just a classroom anymore, it was an arena, and he had just walked away from his second victory. But this wasn't a fight he had chosen. The professors had set the stage, and Marcus had simply refused to play the role they wrote for him. The students around him were buzzing with whispers. "How did he do that?" one asked in disbelief. "I couldn't even read half of it." Another said, "Oh, so." Looked at him with admiration, others with quiet envy. But the professors, their silence was louder than anything. Professor Harrow tried to move on with the lesson, but his voice had lost some of its force. The usual smug confidence wasn't there. He spoke more quickly, as if rushing to finish. Still, Marcus knew it wasn't over. Men like Harrow didn't just accept defeat, okay? They waited. They planned. Okay, struck again when you least expected it. That strike came sooner than Marcus imagined. Near the end of class, Harrow suddenly closed his textbook and said, "We'll finish today with one final exercise for everyone." His voice had that sharp edge again. This is a problem that requires creative thinking. Something most of you will struggle with. The problem he wrote this time wasn't just long, it was deceptive. At first glance, it looked impossible. Numbers tangled with strange symbols, mixed with elements from different branches of mathematics. It was the kind of problem that made even the smartest students hesitate. The professors gave the class 10 minutes to solve it. Heads bent over notebooks, pens scratching, calculators clicking. Murmurs of frustration filled the air. Marcus worked quietly, his pencil moving in clean, steady lines. His mind saw the problem differently, not as a monster of complexity, but as a puzzle with a hidden doorway. He broke it into small pieces, looking for patterns, for symmetry, for the point where everything could fall into place. Halfway through, Harrow walked past his desk, peering down without a word. His eyes flickered briefly when he saw how far along Marcus was. With 5 minutes left, most of the class still had blank spaces on their pages. The professors exchanged glances, clearly expecting no one to solve it completely. Then, with 2 minutes to go, Marcus put down his pencil. His paper was full, every line neat, every step explained. He didn't just have the answer, he had the reasoning, the proof, the entire map of how he got there. When Harrow called for papers, Marcus handed his in without hesitation. He didn't look smug. He didn't need to. The grading began immediately. One professor checked the papers while Harrow continued talking to the class. A few minutes later, the professor grading Marcus's work looked up, stunned. "It's perfect," he whispered to Harrow. Harrow's face remained still, but there was a flicker, the faintest shadow of defeat. He cleared his throat. "Well, it appears we have one student who has managed to solve it correctly." He glanced at Marcus. "Mr. Marcus, would you care to explain your solution to the class?" Marcus walked to the board once more. His explanation was clear, simple, and even a little humble. He didn't rush, and he didn't make anyone feel small. Instead, he broke down the steps in a way that made the problem seem almost easy. By the time he was done, the atmosphere in the room had changed completely. Students who once smirked at him were now nodding with respect. Some even clapped quietly. The professors didn't join in. Their expressions were polite, but their pride was bruised. Marcus returned to his seat, knowing the truth. He hadn't just answered their question. He had taken control of the narrative. In that moment, he stopped being the student they wanted to embarrass and became the student they couldn't ignore. Asterisk, asterisk, the bell rang, but no one rushed to leave. It was strange. Usually, as soon as class ended, students scrambled for the door. Today, they lingered, still caught in the aftershock of what had just happened. Marcus could feel the eyes on him, not sharp and mocking like before, but searching, curious, even admiring. Professor Harrow stayed behind his desk, flipping through Marcus's paper again, as if he might suddenly find a mistake hiding between the lines. But there was none. Every number, every symbol, every explanation was flawless. One of the other professors, an older man with silver hair, leaned over and whispered something to Harrow. Harrow's lips tightened. He nodded once, but his jaw was clenched, as if the words had left a bitter taste in his mouth. Students began approaching Marcus, their voices low at first. "That was amazing," one said. "Man, I couldn't even figure out the first step," another admitted. A girl from the front row leaned over his desk. "Do you tutor?" she asked with a shy smile. Marcus thanked them politely, but he didn't linger on the attention. He knew this wasn't just about impressing his classmates. This was about something bigger, because respect from the students was easy to see, but respect from the professors, that was different. And he could feel it starting, slowly, like the first crack in a wall. The next class came, and Harrow behaved differently. There was no smirk, no sly trap waiting in the opening minutes. Instead, his questions were spread evenly among the students. But when Marcus spoke, Harrow actually listened, really listened, before nodding in approval. It wasn't friendly, not yet, but it wasn't hostility either. It was the cautious acknowledgement of a man who had underestimated someone and was now forced to reconsider. The turning point came a week later. The department hosted an open problem-solving session, a kind of public intellectual challenge, where professors, graduate students, and undergraduates could all attempt the same set of high-level problems. It was part competition, part show. And everyone knew it was a chance to impress the academic elite. Marcus hadn't planned on participating, but that morning, as he walked past the notice board, Harrow stopped him. "You should enter," Harrow said. His tone was even, not mocking this time. It would be interesting to see what you can do in front of the entire department. Marcus met his eyes. There was no challenge in his own voice when he replied, "All right." The event hall was buzzing with energy. The problems were brutal, some designed to stump even seasoned mathematicians. Participants sat in rows, working silently, the clock ticking overhead. Professors walked between tables watching, occasionally making notes. Marcus worked methodically, moving from one problem to the next. His pace was steady, his mind clear. He didn't think about impressing anyone. He just thought about solving the puzzle in front of him. When time ran out, the papers were collected. The grading began immediately. Teams of professors going through the submissions. Marcus sat quietly, sipping water, feeling no need to check over his work again. Then the murmurs began. First from one table of graders, then spreading to others. A few professors glanced up, scanning the room, their eyes stopping briefly on Marcus. Finally, Harrow himself walked to the front of the hall. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight it hadn't before. "It appears," he said slowly, "that Mr. Marcus has achieved a perfect score." The room erupted in applause, not polite clapping, but genuine, sustained applause that filled the air. Marcus stood, not with arrogance, but with quiet composure, nodding once in acknowledgement. And in that moment, Harrow did something no one expected. He stepped forward, extended his hand, and said, "Well done, Mr. Marcus. Very well done." The handshake was brief, but it meant everything. It was more than just a gesture. It was an admission. Marcus had earned their respect. Not because he had demanded it, not because he had humiliated them, but because he had shown them something they couldn't deny. Undeniable skill, backed by quiet confidence. Still, Marcus knew the story wasn't over. There was one more test ahead, not of math, but of character. Word of Marcus's perfect score spread through the department like wildfire. By the next morning, students were still talking about it in the cafeteria, in study halls, even in the library. Some told the story as if they had been there themselves, adding little details, describing the look on the professors' faces, the quiet confidence Marcus had carried the whole time. But Marcus didn't chase the attention. He walked through the campus the same way he always had, calm, reserved, a small backpack slung over his shoulder. The only difference was the way people looked at him now. It wasn't the curious, doubtful glance he used to get. It was a nod of acknowledgement, a sign of respect. In the lecture hall, the change was even more noticeable. When Marcus entered, conversations quieted for a moment before starting again. A few students smiled at him, some raising their hands in a silent greeting. And the professors, they greeted him too, their tone polite, their eyes sharper, but no longer carrying the weight of condescension. That day, the lecture was different. Harrow didn't single Marcus out with surprise questions or impossible problems. Instead, he opened the floor for discussion and listened carefully when Marcus spoke at one point. Harrow even asked, "Marcus, how would you approach this differently?" It was subtle, but everyone in the room felt the shift. It was no longer a test meant to corner him. It was a genuine request for insight. Marcus answered with the same clarity and simplicity as always, laying out his reasoning step by step. Even the graduate assistants leaned in, taking notes. Later, as class ended, Harrow called Marcus to the front. "There's a departmental research project starting next month," Harrow said, his voice low enough for only Marcus to hear. "I'd like you to be part of it. You'll be working alongside senior students and a few professors." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You're sure about that?" he asked. Harrow gave a small smile, not mocking, not forced. "I'm sure. Talent like yours, we don't see it often. Man, when we do, we don't waste it." The offer was more than just a chance to work on something important. It was proof that the respect Marcus had earned was now solid, undeniable. The same people who had once plotted to embarrass him were now inviting him to stand beside them. As Marcus left the hall, a few students fell into step beside him, asking if he could explain some concepts to them later. One even said, "Man, you've changed the whole vibe in there. Even the professors are acting different." Marcus didn't answer right away. He just smiled faintly. Because he knew something they didn't respect wasn't about beating someone in front of an audience. It was about showing, again and again, that you belonged. No matter how many times people tried to push you out, and Marcus had shown them. Now, with the final weeks of the semester ahead, there was only one thing left, not a battle for respect, but a chance to leave a mark that would last long after he was gone. Asterisk, asterisk, the last day of the semester arrived with the soft glow of winter sunlight, spilling through the tall windows of the lecture hall. The air carried a strange mix of excitement and quiet reflection, the kind of feeling that comes when something important is about to end. Marcus walked in as he always did, calm and steady, but the difference now was impossible to miss. Students greeted him with genuine smiles. A few waved. Some moved their bags to make space for him, hoping he might sit nearby. The same classmates who once expected him to fail now looked at him like a leader. The professors were already there, speaking quietly among themselves. Harrow stood at the center, his hands resting on the podium. When Marcus entered, Harrow's gaze followed him not with the challenge of the first day, but with something closer to pride. When the lecture began, Harrow didn't waste time on ordinary topics. Instead, he addressed the room in a voice that carried across every seat. "This semester," he said, "has been one of the most memorable in my years of teaching. We've seen competition, challenge, and most importantly, growth from all of you. But there is one student whose work, composure, and dedication have reminded us all why we do what we do." The room was silent, everyone sensing where this was going. Harrow's eyes found Marcus. "Mr. Marcus, would you join me at the front?" Marcus rose, feeling dozens of eyes follow him. He walked to the podium without rushing, his footsteps steady. Harrow reached under the desk and pulled out a certificate. But it wasn't the usual end-of-term award. This one bore the university's seal of excellence, given only to students who had shown exceptional academic achievement. "Marcus," Harrow said, his voice firm but warm, "you came into this room on the first day as someone we did not know. I admit, some of us misjudged you. You proved us wrong, not by shouting, not by demanding recognition, but by letting your work speak. That is rare, and it is powerful." The applause started softly, then grew louder, echoing through the hall. Students clapped, some even cheering. The professors, one by one, joined in. Marcus took the certificate and shook Harrow's hand. For the first time, the handshake wasn't tense. It was genuine. He turned to face the class, not to gloat, but to speak. "When I got here," he began, "I knew some people had already decided what I could or couldn't do. I didn't try to argue with them. I just did what I came here to do: learn, work hard, and give my best. If there's anything I hope you take from this, it's that you don't let anyone else write your story for you." The room went quiet again, his words settling in. When the applause returned, it felt different this time, not just for a student who had solved hard problems, but for someone who had changed the tone of the room, who had broken a wall without ever throwing a stone. After class, as students and professors filed out, Harrow stopped Marcus. "I hope you know," he said quietly, "you've earned more than just an award. You've earned my respect. And that is harder to win than any problem I can write on a board." Marcus smiled, the kind of small, knowing smile that held a whole journey inside it. He didn't need to say much. The semester had already said everything for him as he stepped out into the crisp winter air. The sun felt warmer, the sky wider. The road ahead was open, not because someone had given him permission to walk it, but because he had proven to everyone and to himself that he belonged there, and in the quiet of that moment, Marcus knew this wasn't just the end of a semester, it was the beginning of everything. The semester was over. But Marcus's story didn't end when the grades were posted. In fact, that's when it truly began to spread. Winter break at the university meant empty hallways and quiet classrooms. But Marcus was still on campus some days, working in the library, researching advanced problems, and preparing for the upcoming research project Harrow had invited him to join. He preferred the silence, the absence of hurried footsteps and loud conversations. One afternoon, as he sat in a study corner by the tall windows, a first-year student approached him nervously. Marcus recognized him from the back rows of class. Quiet, shy, always avoiding eye contact. "Hey," the student began, his voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted to say thanks." Marcus looked up from his notebook. "For what?" For what you did this semester. Standing there, solving those problems when they tried to make you look small. I saw that. I'm from a small town, and I felt like I don't belong here since the first week. But when I saw you..." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "It made me think, maybe I can belong too." Marcus didn't say much. Just a small nod and a simple, "You do belong. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The student smiled awkwardly, then left. But his words stayed with Marcus longer than he expected. Over the next few weeks, Marcus noticed more people approaching him, not to praise him, but to ask for advice, for help with their studies, for guidance on how to handle the pressure of being underestimated. He realized he had become something more than just the math genius. He had become a quiet source of courage for people who felt overlooked. The biggest surprise came when Harrow asked him to step into his office. One snowy afternoon, inside, the shelves were lined with books and framed certificates. Harrow gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Marcus," he said, "there's an opportunity I think you should consider. The university is hosting an international mathematics symposium next term. The best minds from around the world will be there: professors, researchers, even industry leaders. I want you to present." Marcus blinked. "Me? Present?" "Yes," Harrow said firmly. "You've proven yourself in this classroom. Now it's time you show the world beyond these walls what you can do." It wasn't lost on Marcus how far they had come from a professor who tried to humiliate him in front of his peers, to one now trusting him to represent the entire department. That night, Marcus walked across the snow-covered campus, his breath visible in the cold air. Lights from the library glowed in the distance, and the quiet hum of the city beyond the gates seemed softer somehow, He thought about everything: the first day's tension, the impossible problems, the whispered doubts, and the slow, steady shift from being underestimated to being respected. But most of all, he thought about the people who had started to believe in themselves because they had seen him refuse to bow under pressure. Marcus smiled to himself. This was no longer just about him, and as the wind swirled through the bare trees, he felt a certainty settle inside him. Whatever came next, he was ready. Not because he was a genius,